Good afternoon, everyone. I hope you had a good lunch. Okay, so nations and corporations today, they're pouring millions, maybe billions into artificial intelligence, and the speed of change has shocked even some scientists what their counterparts are getting up to. Hedge funds, they use AI to make determinations about stock market, and in Singapore we've been talking about autonomous vehicles for a very long time, and the fact that we're all just going to wake up in the morning and jump into them after we've had our schedules sort of laid out by artificial intelligence as well. But we all have different definitions of this thing, I suspect, because we use it interchangeably with machine learning a lot, and I think there are some people who even believe it's the same thing. Let's get straight to the discussion. Gentlemen, give me your definition of where we are today with artificial intelligence. How would you define it?
Well, I tend to be a pragmatist, so my definition of AI is just a system that is able to do intellectual tasks, such as easy things like classification, translation, but also in the future more advanced things such as science and possibly artificial intelligence development itself.
So I think we have to actually look at it in a historical context. I'm the oldest guy in Salesforce, and I love the irony, the oldest guy's in charge of the future. But I started my career at a place called Stanford Research Institute, which was one of the homes of artificial intelligence back in 1972. And then the goal was basically to understand the brain and assume that the brain does computation when it is thinking and doing intellectual tasks, memory, thought, perception, sensing, and so on. Take that understanding, turn it into equations, and put those equations into a computer, and it'll behave like a brain. So we launched a lab in 1969, and we closed the lab in 1975 because we made so little progress. Because that paradigm has basically failed. That is that because it turns out that the brain is much more complex than we ever believed. The US government has a 30-year research program on the human brain, the first 10 years of which are mapping a mouse brain. So about 10 years we'll understand Donald Trump's brain. But having said that, the fundamental paradigm itself has changed. We now have a bottoms-up rather than top-down paradigm. It's machine learning. It's taking a lot of data, feeding it to an algorithm, and having that algorithm carry out useful cognitive functions. But think about, for example, you mentioned, Jaan, language translation. Google Translate, here we're in the Google stage. Google Translate is terrific. We've probably all used it. But when, for example, Google Translate translates, say, the German word house, H-A-U-S, into, say, the Spanish word casa, C-A-S-A. The only thing the computer knows is one string of 4 letters equals another string of 4 letters. It doesn't understand mortgages. It doesn't understand lending. It doesn't understand families or the kids playing on the lawn. All it knows is one narrow set of cognitive capabilities. And language translation software will not drive your car, will not recommend books, will not do facial recognition. You can add all of these up and you do not get to a general intelligence. So I think the current paradigm is really focused on machine learning and data analytics and is very, very useful, but does not pose the kind of risk that I think a lot of people have been afraid of.
You mentioned Google Translate there, Peter, and not too long ago I finished filming for a documentary for Channel NewsAsia, went to China. I don't speak any Mandarin, and my film crew didn't speak any English. We managed to film the entire piece over the course of 15 days without saying a single word to each other, and that was thanks to Google Translate, and I don't even work for Google, and I gave them an ad for that. But the interesting thing was, though, that it is nuance as well, because where there was any discrepancy, I found that, what's that thing called, miming? Miming worked best, using your physical body to actually mime actions. So when we think about artificial intelligence, Jaan, I want to get your take on this. For people who don't know much about it, they're concerned about who is in the driver's seat when it comes to what we're going to see with the use of AI in the future. What's your take?
Myself, I'm kind of concerned that that it will be sort of game theory that will be in driver's seat. So, like, we just kind of we, not by we, I mean kind of individual people, researchers, and companies just kind of climb economic gradient, basically do things that we think are going to be useful to get the paycheck next month without kind of possibly thinking about where this all leads to. So I do think that it's very valuable to have, like what I've been doing in the last 10 years is kind of cultivating an ecosystem in the world of research institutes who are like mostly thinking about long-term issues, like issues what we might have once we have superhuman intelligence, and turns out we have no idea how to prepare for that yet. So like it seems that we do need those decades, even if we have like 50 years left. We might actually use up all those 50 years to think about how can we successfully end the human regime. However, like they also do think like about near-term issues such as jobs, because like it's important to kind of not just do kind of blindly what your current conditions kind of push you to do, but actually take a step back and think about where do we want to end up, and then kind of try to nudge your behavior that way.
Peter, what are your thoughts on that?
Well, so I think there are three risks that you want to think about in talking about AI, and Jaan mentioned one, but the first and the highest level, which I think many people have focused on, is that kind of existential risk, the superintelligence that somehow comes to dominate the human species. That may happen one day, but I think it's very, very far off. I think realistically, there are two big risks. Jaan referred to one, that is the issues of jobs. And then secondly, all the issues having to do with data transparency, access to data, the role of algorithms. When algorithms were recommending books, nobody really cares. But if an algorithm says he's going to get credit and buy a house and you're not, that makes a difference. Or he's going to get a drug and you're not, then it makes a real difference. So the notion of algorithmic transparency, accountability, what are the data used in feeding those algorithms? Are they appropriate? Those issues are very real, as are the issues associated with the use of AI in jobs. So let me give you an example. Everybody's worried about trucking, right? We're going to have self-driving trucks. We're going to eliminate all the truck drivers. In the United States, we have 3.3 million truck drivers. No, we're not going to eliminate them. In fact, you can already see the future of truck drivers. Outside of Las Vegas, there's a building that is run by the U.S. Air Force. And in that building, pilots go to work every day, but they don't get in cockpit. They sit in front of a computer screen and they fly a drone halfway around the world. That's the truck driver of tomorrow. The truck driver of tomorrow will sit in front of a computer screen, pick up his first truck, drive it through the city streets of, say, San Francisco, put it on the freeway, head it off to Las Vegas, self-driving. Pick up a second truck, drive it through the city streets, put it on the freeway, head it off to Portland. And eventually he's got 5 trucks on the freeway. First one is being arrived, picks that up, drives it through the city streets to its ultimate target. This is not science fiction. A company called Starsky Robotics is building these trucks today. Billiton Mining in Australia runs its trucks remotely for safety reasons. So the skill set for the truck driver of the future is Grand Theft Auto. And so we're going to have many more truck drivers. They're going to know their husband or their wife. They're going to know their kids. They're not going to die in accidents, and they're not going to suck fumes all day. And we need many more of those because we're delivering more stuff to more places. So I think it takes imagination to see the jobs of the future. And the real concern, I think, is a failure of imagination.
Jaan, do you have the same kind of confidence that Peter has in that vision of the future, that humanity will just somehow figure it out based on the socio-economic factors of the day?
No. So I think that is the main difference between us, is that like even like we had like a short backstage discussion that I'm way less confident about what's going to happen even in the near future. Therefore, like I think it's prudent to kind of prepare for all sorts of possibilities. And so yeah, that's my answer.
Okay, let me press you on that point then. We may not be adequately prepared. We've got to do more. What do we have to do then, now in 2018 and looking forward?
So as I mentioned, I've been kind of cultivating an ecosystem. We support about 10 or a dozen organizations. 2 of them have co-founded, one in Cambridge, US, Future of Life Institute, another one in Cambridge, UK, Center for the Study of Existential Risk. They tend to think about all sorts of risks, as I mentioned earlier, and also like risks that are not about AI. For example, I do think that in the near term, synthetic biology might pose even a greater risk. but like my specialty just is in AI, so I do think a lot about AI. And in AI front, the overarching term that we now use is AI alignment. So the idea is that like once we have something that is potentially superhuman, that it kind of relates to us as we relate to, I don't know, like rabbits. Therefore, like it's reasonable to assume that things like control over the environment is basically environment is under its control. And the reason why we send robots to space and radioactive areas is that they do not care about the environment. So like if we don't manage, we are biological, so we are very kind of finely tuned for a very narrow range, narrow environmental parameter range. So if we don't, so we really care about the environment remaining stable. If we don't kind of transmit that concern about the environment to an AI, but that by default will not care about the environment, we die in a matter of minutes. So, or like however long it takes to kind of radically change the environment. And this is just one example of the AI alignment. We need, in general, align the idea of what we think is a good future for humanity, or that what we should think if we were smarter, with what the AI will think as a good future.
Look, I agree that we ought to be concerned. I agree that we ought to be attentive to these things. It's a matter of time frame and what the nature of that is. So I think what we need to do now is assure transparency, for example, in AI research, transparency in the data, being able to be accountable as researchers, to have that open conversation. I'm not going to say much about Salesforce, but we've created the Office of Ethical and Humane Use of Technology precisely around being able to pay attention to that. So I think while you and I may have a different view on the time frame here, I think we do share the view that it is necessary to pay attention to it, because if I'm wrong and you're right, then we'd better be prepared. And you know, I'm prepared to exist that I might be wrong.
Awesome.
So we're at the Singapore FinTech Festival, and you know, finance is going to come into the equation, you know, at some point. We were talking earlier in a session about the number of people who don't have bank accounts, right? Who don't have micro companies, very small companies, or people who farm the land, who don't have access, you know, to sort of where they put their profits and so on. Banks are looking at those. We're still kind of at a very strange curve when you look at the development globally. When we think of people don't even have, a large number of them don't even have access to sanitation. Here we are talking about another kind of a world. At what speed are we talking about this change happening? You were saying 50 years, it may be, to you, is a short amount of time.
Well, 50 years is a long amount of time for me. Like my own kind of timelines basically right now dictate about like 25, 30 years for like 50% probability of superhuman intelligence. I might kind of adjust them as I get more evidence one way or another way. But in that concept, what was the question again?
Well, look, just to respond, I think the question was, there's all these other things going on in the world. Lots of people don't have access to even some of the kind of core technologies like sanitation and water that you mentioned. But look what's happened in the last 25 years in lifting literally something on the order of 2 billion people out of poverty, and that has everything to do with modern technology. Education, electricity, access to the world's information, and so on. We're doing a spectacular job worldwide of lifting more and more people out of poverty. We have a long way to go, but in the last 20 years, we've gone from a world where we had roughly about 2 billion people living well to about 6 billion people living well. We've still got another billion or so to go. So I don't want to underestimate that. But if you think about it, things like AI can be very useful in that process. For example, education. Tools of remote learning, simple tools for learning. We've seen a huge investment in educational technologies and using AI, for example, for teaching language. Things like Duolingo, very simple program, essentially free language education. So I think AI can be very useful in that process of lifting those people out of poverty, and over time, it will become accessible on a nearly universal basis.
I totally agree with that. By the way, I'm a chairman of one of the Duolingo's competitors, linguist. So yeah, it's like one of the reasons why I focus on AI because I do think that that potential for good is just enormous there. So it's like clearly in the short term, as you talked about, but also in the long term. Like if we manage to fix synthetic biorisk, for example, we still have like other risks to contend with, asteroid risks, AI risk. However, if we fix AI risk, we basically will like get the other fixes for free, because like other fixes, like fixing other problems almost always takes intelligence, and if we have intelligence, plenty of intelligence, we're gonna fix those.
What about the threat to jobs, though, and to employment as we know it today? Because automation is already taking jobs which humans used to be able to do quite adequately, but in the AI world, it's not efficient, it's not fast enough, and it affects the bottom line. So what happens to that?
Yeah, again, like, I leave kind of short-term, thinking about short-term problems, mostly to others, so they don't have like a lot of expertise in these. I tend to be uncertain about this. It might go one way, it might go another way. Like, for example, one kind of a classical example that is brought up is that look what happened to horses. When we had like massive automation, like clearly like, we had something that was able to replace them. Now, but it's still possible that we will have enough jobs around. Like sometimes I joke that we seem to have a lot of bullshit jobs that don't actually produce value, and they seem to be by nature not vulnerable to automation. But in the long run, I just don't think that human economy will continue. As a friend of mine says, that once you have superhuman intelligence that is able to rearrange atoms at will, it's not going to just sit there and wait for you to buy things from it.
Look, when that comes around, it's a different situation. But in the near term, with respect to, say, financial services, look, we already had one brilliant example, ATMs. Right? ATMs came along in the 1970s and 80s. Everybody expected bank tellers were going to go away. We wouldn't need people anymore, and that was completely wrong. What changed was the nature of the job. Bank tellers don't spend any time just handing out and collecting cash anymore. The ATM does that. The bank teller does a more sophisticated job that requires interaction with a human being. And that, I think, is the paradigm. We'll take very, very simple tasks and hand it to the machine. What humans will do will relate to other human beings. So let's take an example that's already playing out. That is the new kind of frictionless store. Right? You walk into the store, facial recognition recognizes you've walked in, you go around to buy stuff, sensors pick up that you've bought something, and you can walk out. So you didn't need that person at the checkout stand. So what's that person going to do? What that person's going to do is walk the floor, and when you have a question and you have an issue, listen, I don't really know which of these soup mixes really is going to work for my sauce that I want to make. They're going to ask you a question, and they're going to answer that. And you, as a salesperson, are going to interact with me as a human being. And that simple task of adding up the results when I walk out the store, that the machine can do well. So we're going to give people tasks that relate to other people, and the kind of mechanical tasks of, say, checkout will be handled by the AI. And we'll see that in more and more contexts where the kind of routine mechanical tasks can be handled by AI, and those that require empathy, judgment, engagement, all of those things that human beings uniquely do and will do for a long time. It'll be a while, even before superintelligences have compassion, empathy, and capability to relate to others.
Do we want it to have empathy?
That's another question. Yeah.
Do we want to train it or to put inputs into AI that, predict empathy and behavior? Because
yeah, that is a tricky question. I do think that even in before we get to superhuman intelligence, there might be kind of critical domains where you have like sufficiently powerful narrow AI, you might have like very unstabilizing effects. We saw that with this Facebook scandal and US elections. And when you talk about empathy, like you implicitly actually talk about AIs that's able to manipulate people if it understands people well. So like, yeah, psychology, politics, AI development, general strategic thinking. Like these are areas where you actually should apply AI very carefully.
But isn't our behavior already being altered
Yes.
to a great extent, right? I mean, the little notifications flag in bright red on your phone compels you to click it. And I think our phones can even collect which ones we go to first. to understand our behavior better. AI is going to be able to understand our patterns of behavior just via our mobile devices.
Yeah, so like that's what I was saying, that it's important to kind of like take a step back, and instead of like just rushing towards the default future, we should kind of think about what do we actually want and then kind of alter our course.
Well, look, I think the next platform is already evident. Today, is there anybody in the room who does not carry a smartphone? Right, couldn't live without it. And that's only been 10 years. We can already see what's coming next, and it AI-based. You want to think about what's about to happen. We all have smartphones, but this began with a much cruder device about 15 years ago called the BlackBerry, right? Some of you will remember a BlackBerry, very crude version of this, but it gave you a hint of what was to come. Today's Amazon, Alexa, Google Home, Apple Siri give you a hint of what's to come. They're the first step. They're the equivalent of the BlackBerry for the really intelligent assistant that will come along in about 5 years' time, so that everyone will have a personal digital assistant that will do several things. It will help manage your personal identity, your data, what you share with other people, and will interact with other assistants. It will take the friction out of life. It will enable many transactions to happen friction-free and allow you to focus on the things that actually matter. And that personal assistant will protect your data, will share it when it's appropriate, and provide you services that are unique. It will be what every rock star and CEO has today, right? They don't fill out their expense reports. They don't do their own check-in at the airport, right? You won't have to either. Everyone will have that. Fairly smart. It won't be very smart, but it'll be smart enough to figure out where your hotel room is, figure out where the right gate is, figure out actually maybe what the right financial transaction. Everybody will have a personal financial assistant that will help them manage their money in a more thoughtful way. Again, it won't be profound intelligence, but it'll help them make slightly better choices in a more informed way and provide them the information they need when they need to make a choice.
Yeah,
in this case, like it's like really important to think about the incentives of the companies who develop those assistants, and because like by default their incentives are to modulate our economic or political behavior. So like it's important that people actually pay for those, that they are in the service of the customers.
Right. So we want to be able to put some decision-making power in the hands of artificial intelligence, but how much is too much decision-making power?
Yes, that's a good question. The community that I belong to, or a sub-community, is they call themselves rationalist movement, and there they have this like a bunch of techniques how you can improve your thinking. One of those techniques is what they call taboo the word, and it's basically you want to say something, but you're not allowed to use a word. And for example, you can taboo the word AI. And one way to substitute for AI is delegating decisions to machines. And like if you just read a sentence that contains AI and you make that substitution, it suddenly sounds very, very different. Like for example, we should accelerate the uptake of AI. We should accelerate the delegation of human decisions to machines. Like already sounds like a bit like iffy. So indeed, I do think that we should quite often think about AI as delegation of our decisions, and think about where do we want to draw the line, which decisions we want to retain, and what we're okay to give to machines. For example, one really, really critical domain in the near future is military. We really, really should be careful about delegating military decisions. And the reason is not because of the precision or quality of those decisions. That might well go up. The issue is that if we remove humans from the loop, it means that we are going to hand out the military power to organizations that do not have humans, which means that we will be arming non-state actors. We will be creating eventually a world where it's no longer safe to be outside, because we will also create a trend that we already see in cyber, that it becomes very cheap to kill people anonymously. So right now we have cyber attacks, we don't know who did it. We might, if you have a fully autonomous decision-making in military, means that we are going to have attacks and we will never know who did it.
Though as Jaan knows, many years ago I wrote a movie called War Games that actually dealt with what happens when you take the humans out of the loop, right? And the computer whopper nearly started World War III, thinking it was playing a game. So I share that concern. But it's also important to recognize that, I was at the National Gallery here the other day, and there's a horrific painting there of the My Lai massacre during the Vietnam War. Where American soldiers murdered a number of Vietnamese peasants. Human beings did that. Robots are less likely to do that. That is that the AI warrior doesn't get angry, their wife didn't get raped, they're not drunk, they're not sleepy, they're not overtired, and maybe, and I'm not yet arguing that this is a good idea, but maybe robot warriors might be less dangerous than human beings. Maybe.
Well, in some context, sure, but like in general, if you have like a slave that never questions you, and never kind of hesitates to pull the trigger, like that would be basically, again, executing the decisions of someone who might be like non-state or psychopath actor.
So research and development is not the domain of just some. I mean, it's available to everyone, right? Do you question the motivation then of some AI developers?
No. Like I happen to know a lot of top researchers in the world. I mean, my previous position at some point was I was the director of DeepMind, which is probably the most leading AI research group in the world. So I know those people, and they are generally good people.
So it is to make the world a better place, to put it simply?
It is. Now, the issue there is that they are, and I have had this conversation with, just one conversation concretely comes to mind with an AI developer who came to me is like, look, I now know that the most impactful thing that he could be doing is, or no, I now know that the most impactful thing that I could be doing is AI safety research. However, I get so much accolades and so much positive feedback when I push the AI capability boundaries. So it's actually for my mental health, it's very difficult to change to something where people that I know is very valuable, but people don't recognize how valuable it is. So it's like what I took away from that conversation is like we need to make AI safety research sexy.
I would agree with that. Look, I think there's every reason to pay attention today to the consequences of that. And another film that I helped write a few years ago was a film called Minority Report. And that world exists today in China, right? Where we have ubiquitous ability to detect everyone, facial recognition. On the other hand, they're gaining a lot of benefits from that. Efficiency, well-organized society, et cetera. And I suspect, and I suspect many of you here are from China and might have a view that actually life has gotten a hell of a lot better in this world of radical transparency in China, where systems work incredibly well, where poverty is not coming to an end, where lots of people are being lifted out of poverty as a result. Now, that's starting from a very different cultural and social and political context for the application of AI in the real world. I think the world of Minority Report does exist in China already.
So before I throw the questions to, I've got quite a few questions here from the audience for you, but give me your predictions then for where we're going with artificial intelligence. Where do you see the world? Let's take that 50-year view.
I mean, in 50 years, like unless we manage to screw up some other ways, some any other way, like have a nuclear war, which is still not ruled out, right? Then I think it's much more likely than not that we will have the human era, which has lasted for 100,000 years, has ended.
And I don't share that view. I do think that that in 50 years we will have much more powerful artificial intelligences, but will not yet have achieved general intelligence and let alone superintelligence. So I think maybe someday we will get to superintelligence, but I don't think the current path of primary development is getting us in that direction of even general AI fundamentally, and that I think we will eventually get there, but my guess is it's more like a century.
I want to go back to Jaan's point, your position, how you feel about this, where that pessimism comes from. Where does that pessimism come from?
Well, first of all, it kind of sounds like pessimism because, I don't think, I've been kind of
Depends about your perspective, right?
Train to talk to people in a way that kind of wakes them up. But like I do think that it doesn't necessarily mean like the end of human era means like very unfamiliar situation. Obviously, like we have a lot of intuitions from the last 100,000 years, but it doesn't necessarily mean bad because
different.
It's likely very different.
Do you think it means different across the board? We're talking politically, socially, economically. Do we have to sort of start again?
I think we should like first of all zoom out from this planet and look at the entire. As I'm a physicist, so look at the entire light cone. So it's like Hubble volume and possibly very likely actually beyond. So it's like one of the mistakes that we actually might be doing, which is like I mean. War games is like a wonderful movie for that. Is that we might be just playing the wrong game, like that we kind of like almost all the value is outside of this planet. This planet is just a tiny weird speck in the universe. And if we are playing kind of zero-sum games, like who's going to develop AI first? Like it's just like just silly. Like we're playing like a zero-sum game in a tiny speck of a corner of the entire playing field. We should really think about the entire game board and think about what is the correct game for that.
We share that. I'm an astronautical engineer. I'm actually a rocket scientist, literally. So I share that kind of cosmic perspective. But I also think that, frankly, there's just a lot we can do in the near future to make this stuff actually very, very useful in the context that we're operating in.
Yeah, I don't disagree with that at all. Yeah.
Okay, so let's get to some questions that the audience have posed, and this one has been voted up the most. It's about the future of education. Are children prepared at all for a world of artificial intelligence, this world that they'll be living in, children born today? Is the education system aligned as we see it now?
Not yet. But I think it's, we're moving in better directions is what I'd say. Over the last 5 years, we've seen an enormous investment in educational technology based on new understandings of neurobiology, new ways of learning, etc. So I think the necessity for example, lifetime learning, continuous learning. I started a new career at 65. I think that's going to be typical, not rare. So I think over the course of life, this is where AI in education is going to be particularly useful, helping people navigate all the changes that they need to go through and all the learning that they need to do on a continuous basis.
Jaan?
Yeah, I was exposed to this thought that like one difference between Western thought and Eastern thought is that Western people tend to think about the social institutions as a set of mechanisms, whereas Eastern people tend to think about the social institution as a set of organisms. And I do think that both education and healthcare are clearly much more organisms than they are mechanisms. So like they are systems that have just evolved over time, which means that in a rapidly changing environment, they're almost guaranteed to be out of date. Therefore, like I don't think they are adequate right now.
And if you think about it, the thing people ask, what should kids be learning? Well, it's not coding. Yeah, coding is important, but the machines will eventually do that a whole lot better. It is what we talked about earlier: empathy, compassion, the ability to collaborate, the ability to lead, the ability to make good judgments, the ability to work with others. These are the human skills that we want to really develop in our kids in education.
By the way, as a coder, I do think that coding helps with that, because like there are like a few like properties of a coder that non-coders don't necessarily understand. Like one of them is that a coder has an intuitive sense what it means to have your thoughts fully specified.
I want to weigh in on that, because when it comes to education, we talk about the fact that kids today aren't being prepared, right, for this digital disruption, let alone a future with artificial intelligence where decisions are made for them and so on, or that it gives them more time to do the things that are important. That's another one that's often thrown at us, when AI, can make those decisions, you have more time. Who here remembers when they were saying that about washing machines, for example, or other, modern conveniences, that they were going to give us more time? It was a lie. Modern conveniences never gave us more time. We're all racing for time more than ever before.
Because we've taken more things to do. But you're not spending as much time as sitting over a basin
I've been
watching
wanting to
clothes.
ride a horse for years. I haven't got around to it yet. What's it going to take? I mean, are we being sold something here that is perhaps we can't really
I
reconcile.
think you're referring again to this topic that now has come up repeatedly. Like we are playing a certain game. So like if you are in a certain competitive situation, then you like whenever you are kind of when you have something that saves your time, but you're still in that competitive situation, it means that you're incentivized to immediately use that extra time to something that again kind of increases your competitiveness over others.
Look, I think modern conveniences have created alternative uses of your time. And the question is, what do you choose to do with that alternative use of your time? Do you take on more work? Do you take on other tasks around the home? And so on. So I think it is a misperception to say that it hasn't actually created more time. It has. And these tools, I think, will do the same. That is, they will free up human beings to do things that uniquely human beings can do.
But going back to my example about Google Translate,
Yeah.
I always wanted to learn Mandarin, right? And then I had to do a project that required it, and all of a sudden I didn't need to anymore. That took away my motivation to take up lessons. I was like, let Google Translate do it for me.
Sure, but if you have a real passion for language, you might use the tool that Jaan developed, or you might use Duolingo or several others that might help you learn Italian, for example.
Or understand the nuance of Chinese culture, perhaps,
The language that you have in your head, you can use in different contexts.
Yes. Okay, let's go to another question, which, let me see now, this one. Right, we spoke briefly about this, so let's go for this one again since it's had quite a few votes. How do you approach ethics when using AI or other technologies?
Yeah, this is a very important question. I think it starts with transparency.
Right.
And that is to be absolutely transparent about the data that is used to feed an AI, the algorithms that comprise it, and the right of individuals to inspect both the data and the algorithms that are likely to affect decisions that impact them. So right. I think that's the most important requirement for the ethical use of the technology.
Yeah, I think that again we should kind of think about like it's a perfect sentence where you make that substitution. How do you think about ethics when you think about delegating your decisions to machines? So like you should think about what decisions you will delegate and what would the corner cases be. Like will it, because like if your machine will make like machine-like decisions, and you don't want to, you need to think about the domain of that decision making. It shouldn't kind of go beyond where it has competence, because it doesn't have common sense.
One of the questions is asking here is who should make these decisions? And I think that's a real challenge here. I don't know if any of you watched the hearings in Washington, D.C. when they had the hearings with Facebook and several other people, and you watched the U.S. senators engage in the most hopeless conversation with Mark Zuckerberg and others on the technology. Zero comprehension. And so I think there is a real challenge here in the regulation. That is that regulators are often very far behind. Frankly, Ravi Menon, who spoke here, is way ahead of everybody else on this. Ravi really gets it. But having said that, I think this is a real challenge for regulators. How do they keep up with the technology and actually be engaged in setting the rules for the use of AI?
So would you say that a lot of the problems then are not even technological at all? It's about being more explicit with what our goals are?
Well, that is the big question. So there wasn't so much to say about here that. So like when I talk about AI alignment, it really has two components. One is figuring out where this world should be going, and the second part is like making AIs to do it. Both are really hard because like philosophers have had like thousands of years to think about the first problem, and now we need answers, and those answers need to be kind of programmable. Luckily, we already have some ideas. And by we I mean this constellation of research organizations that I support, and they tend to have like this common denominator of how can we use AI to figure out what we want, or even more precisely, how can we use AI to figure out what we should want, we as humanity should want, and also like make sure that we collect the input, not from just like tech people, but from everyone.
Yeah, I heard an interesting comparison about that, which related to an analogy with cooking. You don't want to see your food being made. I think that's arguable. It depends. But you go to a restaurant, you don't want to see your food being made, you just want it served, you don't want to know what the ingredients are, you just want the experience to be wonderful every single time, right? So that brings me to this question, which is also voted up in the audience. This is an interesting one. Questions keep moving around. Technology, it's moving around. Would recommendation algorithms and similar AI further reinforce a tribal, more polarizing society where people only see or read what they want and are perhaps unable to handle discourse at all?
Yeah, by default, yes. Like I think that like we have like genuine, like we have evolved in an African savanna like 50 to 100,000 years ago, and or that's where our social intuitions at least evolved. And unfortunately, they are not very compatible with global world. So we have to like take deliberate step to kind of in some ways kind of counter our intuitions if we kind of actually want to end up where we want. And one of them is indeed not just kind of blindly consume what feels good, just like with sugar, right? We should apply the same kind of constraints to our news consumption.
Look, I think I agree with Jaan that we are basically tribal, but I think, and we've had that play out recently with the Facebook issues in politics. I think that did feed the kind of tribalism in America very clearly. I think it's helped feed it elsewhere. Having said that, the AI can also help break that tribalism, i.e. it can foster communication across tribal boundaries. It can make people aware of their own behavior in a tribal sense. It can make them aware of the differences of other people and take that into account. So in my view, one of the answers to the problem that we've identified here, which is real, and we, you know, look, my country is suffering because of that. We had an election that was stolen because of that, in my view. Having said that, it is clearly the case that one of the ways that AI can be useful is in helping to break that boundary. Look, we just, this was the first experience of anything like Facebook. We've never had anything like that before, where we had the ability of users to generate content and have it be curated by what amounted to an AI and feed people's own tribal instincts. I think the next generation of technology will begin to change that, and we'll learn how to break those boundaries in more thoughtful ways. We've just barely begun this process, but undoubtedly it has played out in a very negative way so far.
We have time for one more question. Now I'm going to take this one, which is a rather existential one, but will we ever achieve singularity? And if yes, when? What will it take? How is it going to affect us? And what should we do to prepare for it? And if no, why not?
So, first of all, I kind of actively dislike the term singularity because it means like too many things to too many people. What I usually talk about is at human level intelligence or superhuman intelligence, because it's like they seem to be like pretty similar, because once you have something that is at the same level than humans are with AI development, you will have the smartest systems on this planet that are no longer human developed. Yeah, my prediction is that like right now I do think that we have like 50% chance of something like that in the next 25, 30 years. After that, I think it's more likely than not. In order to prepare, well, that's what I've been doing for the last 10 years, which is basically trying to figure out who are the smart people who should be more thinking about it, making sure that they have kind of organizations lending my brand to that, and lending my financial support, and trying to kind of work as a catalyst. I've been coming to Asia quite a lot recently to kind of talk to people here as well, to see like what, especially in Singapore, I'm very interested in your kind of governance mechanisms, and how can they contribute to resolving those war game-like situations. If you will not get there, well, first of all, we might indeed discover that brain is just like too complicated, and we have like no hope in this century to figure this out. That might be possible. I think more likely we will just screw up some other way, like have nuclear war or have like synthetic pandemic or something like that, which are like not great. So I still hope that we will get there, but we will get there in a prepared way.
So let's define what we mean by singularity. The term was actually created by Werner Vinge, a computer scientist and science fiction writer in the late 70s. It was popularized by Ray Kurzweil. And what it meant was the idea that there came a moment in time where the capability of technology, particularly AI, became so powerful that we couldn't even imagine what was on the other side. And just like it's hard to imagine what's on the other side of a black hole, which is where the term singularity comes from. Actually, the mathematics of physics that defines a black hole is the mathematics of a singularity. So it's this notion that it's very hard to imagine what's on the other side. Kurzweil has argued that this is only a decade or two off, that maybe 2030, 2040, somewhere in that time frame. I don't buy it. I don't buy the idea of the singularity, and I don't buy the idea that it's imminent. Just because I think the problem is so hard. I think the brain is actually the most complex machine that nature has ever produced. And when you look at the way in which it actually functions, I think it's going to take us a very, very long time. I mean, many decades. And I also have enormous faith in human capacity for imagination. That is, that we can imagine that world beyond, of living in a world in collaboration with AIs, working with superintelligences, being part of a community with extremely smart machines. I understand the argument that why would they bother with us rabbits? Yes, that is entirely plausible. That is one of the outcomes. But I think it's also possible that that what we are going to find is a collaborator, a capability that gives us the ability to do things that is very hard to even imagine today. For example, being able to read mental states of human beings using data, because that is so complex that I could actually read your mental state. I think that will take a really super intelligence to actually be able to do that.
Agreed.
So I think we will get there. But I'm not at all sure that it's anytime imminent. So I'm not worried about the singularity. I don't think it's coming anytime soon.
All right, gentlemen, on that note, thank you very much for that invigorating conversation. Thank you, everybody, for coming. Jaan Tallinn and Peter Schwartz. Thank you.